Hi, this is Jack McDonough. I'm a Colorado CPA, and I'd like to introduce to you today Darrin Mish, an attorney with a national practice based in Tampa, Florida. Hey, Darrin.
Hey, Jack. How are you?
Good. How you doing today?
I'm doing awesome.
Good. Hey, well, Darrin, I got a couple questions I want to ask you. First one is, people call you the IRS problem solver. Is that true?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it is. And I think they call me the IRS problem solver because my practice is virtually all encompassed of the representation of clients who have problems with the IRS. In other words, they owe money to the IRS that they can't figure out how to pay back.
Wow. Well, tell me how you do that.
Well, there's a number of different methods that we use to solve people's IRS problems. It's really a fact-specific thing. It depends upon the amount of money that you owe to the IRS, first of all, the amount of money you make, and the assets that you have. So it's a step-by-step basis, and basically what we do is we get a power of attorney signed by the taxpayer, which allows us to communicate with the IRS so that they don't have to. And we find that that's really crucial for these people. Most of the time, they have so much stress and anxiety about what the IRS might do to them that they're virtually paralyzed. We find that it impacts their relationships, their marriage, their performance at work, their ability to sleep. So it's really crucial that we do an analysis on each case before we determine which option is best to solve their IRS problem.
Great. Well, I've heard about this pennies on the dollar type settlements. Is that true?
Well, yeah. You know, it's funny. The IRS doesn't want us to use the phrase pennies on the dollar anymore. So we radically changed it to you might be able to settle for less, which of course just means the same thing, pennies on the dollar. And what they're talking about is a radical program set up by Congress many years ago called an offer and compromise. And basically what it allows the taxpayer to do is make an offer to settle their tax liability for less. It's designed to get taxpayers who owe way too much money that they'll never be able to pay back into the tax system so that it can become functioning members of the, the tax-paying society, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Well, does everyone qualify for that?
Well, no, not everybody qualifies. Basically, that's why you need a tax pro, preferably an attorney, to help you, because there's a fairly complex analysis that has to go in, and it's basically determining your ability to pay. We look at your monthly income, your monthly allowable expenses, which are set up by the IRS in large part, and your assets. And that sort of goes into this formula, and what comes out of the end of the formula determines how much the IRS is likely to settle your case for with an offer and compromise.
I'm sorry.
It's set up to determine how much you can pay. No more, okay, no less. So there's quite a bit of skill that goes into convincing the IRS that you have a lower ability to pay.
Right. Well, what would make a good candidate, or who would be a good candidate for an offer and compromise?
Well, good candidates for an offer and compromise are typically people who are middle class, perhaps with children, perhaps without children, but basically people without large amounts of equity in their home typically are good candidates, or if they owe just an enormous amount of debt to the IRS, that's also a good candidate for an offer and compromise. But it's really hard to say just on this call today who exactly is a great candidate. But basically, if you feel like you owe more to the IRS than you can pay, then odds are you're a good candidate for an offer and compromise.
That's great. Well, I've read in a newsletter about you settling a $99,000 tax liability for only $1,000, and I also read about a $224,000 tax debt that you settled for $2,240. Is that really true?
Absolutely, it is true. And see, what's the key thing, or the important distinction that we need to make here, is that it doesn't matter at all how much you owe to the IRS, as long as it's more than you can afford to pay. So in those two cases, I guess that's about a penny on the dollar, isn't it?
Yes.
And see, what was key there is that these two taxpayers only had the ability to pay, with proper planning from their attorney, of course, 1 penny on the dollar. And we have had a number of cases just like that.
Well, if you're not a good candidate for an offer and compromise, are there any other alternatives?
Yeah, one of the things that that can be very useful is obviously a payment plan or installment agreement. That's where you set up a monthly payment that you can afford back to the IRS, and sometimes that will result in the full payment of the liability, and sometimes it doesn't, frankly. Wow. So sometimes, depending on, maybe you have the ability to pay according to the IRS of $100 a month, and you owe $50,000, I mean, sometimes that works out for taxpayers. But basically, again, it goes back to that same financial analysis that we have to do to determine if you're appropriate for an offer. So you really need a professional to negotiate that installment agreement before you do it yourself, because you can really shoot yourself in the foot.
Wow. Well, tell me a little bit about bankruptcy. Is that an option to get out of your taxes?
Yes, it is, and it's really, a lot of people don't know that. In fact, almost every day taxpayers come to my office and say something to the effect of, well, my bankruptcy lawyer told me that their taxes can't be discharged in bankruptcy, and that's just untrue. There are some timing requirements, so it's important to have someone who understands the system really well do an analysis to determine whether or not you're appropriate for a bankruptcy, and so most bankruptcy lawyers don't understand that. But before you ask me another question, there's another option sometimes that can be available, and that's called hardship. And basically, if we can demonstrate to the IRS that you have no ability to pay, sometimes we can get you put into what's called hardship status, and that would mean that you could stay there for quite a long time without having to pay the IRS anything at all.
Wow, that's great. Well, I've heard that a lot of IRS practitioners are kind of, I don't know how to frankly say this, but I guess they're kind of mean and judgmental. And what do you think about that?
I think it's really silly. Normal people, good people, hardworking people can find themselves in these IRS situations where they just don't know what to do. Usually what happens is they know they're going to owe some money for 1 year, and so they don't file that return, and nothing happens, and before you know it, it's been 8 years or 10 years, and they haven't filed returns. And it's really just silly that a tax pro would be mean or judgmental to someone with these problems. We deal with these nice people every single day, and my staff is nothing but compassionate, kind, and hardworking. We know our stuff here, and we guarantee to alleviate your stress and anxiety about your IRS problem with the point of first contact.
That's great. Well, tell me why a client would benefit from hiring you as opposed to having the CPA handle their IRS problem.
Well, lawyers and CPAs are wired differently. We were educated differently. A lawyer tends to look at a client's problem in shades of gray with an outcome in mind. A lawyer wants to win, wants to provide for his client, wants to advocate for his client. CPAs are trained differently. CPAs are trained in very much black and white. They look at the numbers. And sometimes a CPA, this is a broad generalization, but sometimes a CPA will just say, you know what, we lose. Very rarely will you have a lawyer that just says, oh, we give up, we lose. So we're trained differently, and we're trained to be advocates for clients. And CPAs, quite frankly, just haven't had the benefit of that type of training.
Right. Can you represent clients anywhere in the U.S.?
As a matter of fact, an attorney can represent clients anywhere in the United States for a federal tax problem, and we have clients in Venezuela, American Samoa, Benin, which is a country in West Africa, as well as probably half the states in the United States. I just got a client the other day from Missouri, and of course, we're in Florida. So it really doesn't matter where the taxpayer is or where I'm at, frankly, but because my license to practice law works for the whole country.
Right. Well, is there any hope then for people with IRS problems?
Absolutely. Virtually every person who comes into my office leaves this office with two things. They leave this office with diminished stress and anxiety, as well as typically some sort of rough game plan or analysis for how we're going to resolve their problem.
Well, hey, I'm going to come in and sign up, okay?
Let's do it.
That sounds good, Darrin. Thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you, Jack.